Disclaimer. The views, information, or opinions expressed by guest speakers during the Monkey Mind Lab podcast series are solely those of the guest speakers involved and do not necessarily represent those of any entities they represent or of the Monkey Mind Lab or its host, Abir Suri. The Monkey Mind Lab and its host depend on the expertise of the guest speakers for accuracy of information and do not assume responsibility for the content or the verification of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening. The primary purpose of this podcast series is to educate and inform.
Welcome back to the Monkey Mind Lab. On today's episode, we have with us Professor Laurie Essig, a professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Middlebury College, where she also serves as the director of the program. A cultural sociologist by training, her research focuses on the intersection of desire, capitalism, and power, exploring how our dreams of love, beauty, and success are shaped by the world around us. She is the author of Love Inc., Dating Apps, The Big White Wedding, and Chasing the Happily Never After. She's also the author of American Plastic, Boob Jobs, Credit Cards, and Our Quest for Perfection. Through both her scholarship and her classroom, Professor Essig invites students to critically examine the everyday fantasies that often go unquestioned. Please join me in welcoming Professor Laurie Essig.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Why don't we begin with the big three questions, which we kind of answered, but we'd love to hear more from you. Is what do you do, why do you do it, and how did you get into it?
Okay, well, what I actually do now is sort of the opposite of love. I work on fascism, in particular how fascism globally is organizing as an anti-gender ideology movement. So I make a podcast called Feminism, Fascism, and the Future, which a bunch of students here at Middlebury have been involved with. And we go around trying to figure out why fascism is using gender as an internal enemy in a way that's similar to the way earlier fascism used Jews as an internal enemy.
Wow.
So it's kind of the opposite of romance, but
Yeah.
perhaps related.
Okay, and what brought you into the field of romance earlier?
So I've been teaching a course called The Sociology of Heterosexuality for 30 years.
Wow.
In fact, I think I am a grandmother of critical heterosexuality studies. And the idea of that was I had a position as a queer theorist at Yale, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we took queer theory lenses to normative heterosexuality? And so I've been doing that for 3 decades.
Wow. And what sparked your particular interest in this area?
Well, I think it's very common to look at sexual otherness in sexuality studies. And I was really interested 30 years ago and today in looking at what we consider normal as, in fact, a product of culture, history, class, race, and gender, and how we might be more critical of how normative heterosexuality develops. So the class is really about the centrality of normative heterosexuality to citizenship in the U.S. and also to formations of whiteness and white supremacy in the U.S. because we don't really look at normative sexualities ever. Yeah. And so we just assume they're natural and unchanging and just about love and what gods or God wants of us, right? So that was the idea behind the class. And this particular book came along as a function of teaching that class for so many years that I started to think about how romance is an ideology and how that fit in well with other ideological formations of our time.
Okay. So I think that brings us to the big question of the day. Can you swipe right on romance without buying into capitalism? Is love real? How much of it is influenced by everything around us, by expectations, and how much of it is a biological desire or just something innate from more than that?
Yeah, I think look, the body exists and the brain exists, and certain chemicals get produced when we're in love, and certain hormones get produced when we're having intimate relations. That's all true. But what we do with that is so culturally specific. I don't want to say it's unreal, but it's certainly socially constructed. So no one's born wanting a big white wedding. That would be weird, right?
Yeah.
No one's born thinking they need an engagement ring. No one's born thinking they need the perfect honeymoon, right? Those are all things that are produced in us, and mostly produced in us through culture, to some extent through our families, of course, and our families have a huge influence. But there's a whole ideological production of romance in Hollywood, in romance novels, which are the biggest part of U.S. publishing industry, in love songs, in dating apps to some extent, depending on the dating app, but certainly the ones that you're trying to find the one. All of them produce this idea that we need this particular thing in order to find a safe and secure future. And that's the part that's really interesting to me, because I think it should be obvious to most people that a safe and secure future is not produced through a white wedding, right? It's produced by having clean air to breathe and clean water to drink and food and shelter and
Security,
maybe health care, right? So that was the interesting thing to me, is that people are really influenced by the ideology of romance to do certain things, to spend huge amounts of money. The average wedding in the U.S. is about $40,000. It's about $95,000 in urban areas.
Wow.
So to think about people are really spending a lot of resources on this, plus it takes about a year and a half to plan. And it's like, why are they doing that? Because clearly that's not going to lead to a safe and secure future. We should all be joining political movements to save the environment, for instance, or to have health care. Right? There are other things that we could imagine, but those things are very group-based, and we've been so treated in U.S. culture and some other cultures as well to believe that we are individually responsible for our happiness and we're individually responsible for our future. And that's where I think romance works really well with neoliberalism, to convince us to worry about our individual trajectory rather than our community survival.
Interesting. I think that's never one you hear. So going back to the point about romance novels and rom-coms and other things like that, which people see on television, they go, hey, I want that. What's particularly the most driving factor from there that if you look at the world, say, 100 years ago, it was very different. The concept of romance was very different. Hollywood's adapted as well, the kind of films that they're making. What's driving it to where it is today? And I'm bringing with me the Indian perspective of a little bit more collectivistic culture than the individualism in the U.S., and is very family-oriented.
Yeah, so I think if you look at spending on weddings, what you see is they start to rise exponentially during the 1980s in the U.S. I can't speak to India, and I'm sorry, but there certainly is an industry, Bollywood, that produces these kind of desires as well for different reasons, perhaps. But in the U.S., you see wedding spending going up in the 1980s and going up, 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 up. It hasn't gone down. Even during the pandemic, there was only a slight dip in wedding spending. So what you see is a huge desire to spend money on weddings, even as fewer and fewer people living in the U.S. are married. In fact, a minority of U.S. adults are married. So that's a kind of interesting moment when people aren't getting married, but the people who are getting married are spending more and more and more resources on it. And I think the reason is that it represents a kind of happily ever after. I mean, not really, right? Like, we all know that's not really true. But for that moment, you can imagine it's true. And one interesting thing I found when I was writing my book is North Korea and the U.S. under Donald Trump's first presidency were engaging in nuclear rhetoric with each other and one-upmanship. And that was an interesting moment where viewers of the Hallmark Channel, which is all romance movies, right, and that all end happily ever after, went way up during that period because people were so anxious. So when this nuclear saber rattling was going on between Donald Trump and North Korea, viewership of Hallmark movies went way up. And I think it's because that fantasy of a happily ever after is something we need in this incredibly precarious moment, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's safety, it's security, it's your safety blanket in a moment when things are actually not very safe, right? The global climate collapse should be evident to everyone living on Earth at this moment. In the United States and elsewhere, there's been a huge concentration of wealth, and most people have been left worse off in the past 40 years than they were in 1980. And so for that moment, if you can fantasize, but if I just do this thing, if I just have the perfect wedding, I can have my happily ever after. That is a necessary escape valve from this moment. I have zero judgment of that. I think my desire is to get people to engage in those momentary escape valves and a more realistic sense about what we need for a happily ever after for everyone.
Yeah, I think you take the wins that you can get in moments like these, and having a TV wedding, or exactly what you called it, the happily ever after, that if I do this, everything will be fine. If we have a big wedding and we spend a ton of money on it, the married life will be okay and everything will be fine after that. To what extent do you think it's showmanship to show to the world that you're doing okay, that you can afford to spend that much money? And do you think it's more or less about the escape, or is it more to do with the fact that despite everything that's going wrong in the world, you want to kind of show your grounding?
Yeah, what's interesting is people are taking out debt to have weddings in the United States. And a lot of those people already have student loans. So I interviewed a lot of young couples for the book. I would go to these wedding expos where you can pick your caterer and you can have a photo booth rental, et cetera. And so I would go there to interview people as to why they were spending resources on this thing. And they all talked about, well, if we do this, then our marriage will be secure. If we don't do this right, it won't be secure. Now, that's not actually true. And
Of course,
staying together is not in any way, shape, or form related to spending on a wedding. But I think they really believe that. If we take on even more debt to have this wedding, just like the promise of university education here, right? I'll take on debt for university education and it will pay off. I'll take on debt for a wedding, it will pay off. In a previous book, I talked about how people were taking on debt for cosmetic surgery and it will pay off, right? So the entire U.S. economy is structured around debt. So I'm sure very wealthy people are just spending this money. But a lot of people are middle class and teachers and social workers, and they're going to take out debt to do this thing, or at least some debt. And so that's really the crux of it, isn't it? That neoliberalism as an ideology tells us to privatize everything. Privatize your health care, privatize education, privatize security. Everything should be privatized, and then everyone will thrive. But it doesn't actually work that way, right? Actually, we privatize everything and things are really not working. But I think what it's done to us is it's trained people in the U.S. to believe that if I can do this private enterprise of the perfect wedding, I will end up in happily never after. Even happily ever after, excuse me, that was a Freudian slip. I will end up in happily ever after, even if that's not factually true, right? We've been trained to believe it's true, just like we've been trained to think that taking out $48,000 in debt for a university education is worthwhile, as opposed to demanding free higher education for everyone who qualifies.
Let's go back more to the concept of love as we know it today. Is it real or is it put on? And I'm drawing on something I learned in high school. We looked at this book called Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Adichie. And there was an interesting perspective there where it's based in Nigeria, and there's this Anglophile Christian father who would beat his kids up every time they strayed from the path of religion and faith in God. But his way of showing his love was through that, because he thought he was putting his kids back on the right track. Similarly, he would equate love to money, that he would buy his kids things and that's a way of showing love. Would you say that's something that's become more common, especially in America, equating money to love and being like, if I spend a lot of money on a particular person, that's me showing my love. I don't actually need to go down to the human values and show affection or say nice things. Has there been a shift across the board on that front to a more capitalist version of love?
Not really. And I'll tell you why. Marriage has always been an economic proposition.
Yes.
And mostly women were traded like chattel, right? A biblical marriage is that a man should have as many wives as he has cows because that's how many he can support, right? So women have always been traded in marriage. That's why, at least in many cultures, women take men's names. In the U.S., it's 95% of women getting married will take the man's name. That's why a man walks his daughter down the aisle and gives her to the husband. So marriage has always been an economic relationship.
A transaction, really.
A transactional relationship. It never had anything to do with romance. So when does marriage actually get situated into romance? Well, not surprisingly, it comes along with modernity. And in particular, we see something called the companionate marriage happen in the late 1800s, where suddenly marriage becomes something that a woman can say yes or no to. Not in all cultures, not in all classes, and many people couldn't get married, right? They weren't allowed to get married. They were enslaved people, or they were indentured servants, or they were in economic positions that didn't allow it. But among the bourgeoisie, for lack of a better word, women could suddenly say no, in part because first-wave feminism is developing, and there's this sense that women might actually be human. And so we see some of these things that we think of as natural, like engagement proposals, come along in the late 1800s, where a woman actually has a right to say, no, I won't marry you. And if you look at some of the novels of that time, you can see the amount of anxiety that was producing for the man to ask for a hand and be told no by the woman, not by the woman's father, for the first time. We didn't have rings yet, though. I mean, wealthy people exchange jewelry all the time, of course, but there was no such thing as the engagement ring. That comes along with consumer capitalism and World War II. What happens is most diamonds are controlled by the De Beers organization, which is a South African organization. And South Africa was part of the Nazi alliance. And because of that, they weren't allowed to sell diamonds in allied countries. But they could in the U.S. because the U.S. was always a little bit iffy about its relationship to World War II, at least in the 1930s and early 40s. And so they come up with this idea that they will sell diamonds as engagement rings. And Frances Garrity, who's a young woman who works in advertising, she comes up with the slogan, "A diamond is forever." Now, before that moment, diamonds were pretty ordinary things. They're actually pretty ordinary. They're not special, etc. But De Beers comes up with this advertising campaign, "A diamond is forever." They convince men that at that point that they must spend 1 month's salary on that diamond. Now it's 2 months' salary. And that the only way to truly get married is to present a diamond ring in a box on a bended knee. They actually teach men how to do it. They teach them in workshops. They teach them through paying Hollywood producers to use diamonds and engagement rings in their movies. So all of that is completely socially made up. It has to do with consumer capitalism. It has to do with political alliances during World War II. It has to do with the brilliance of convincing people, if you buy this thing, it is forever. But that doesn't mean it's not real, right? That's the thing about it, is just because it's socially constructed doesn't mean it isn't real. Everything that we think of as very deep to who we are, let's say our sexual identity, our gender identity, our national ethnic identity, those are all obviously social constructions. Somebody had to make them up. No one is born thinking they're a particular sexuality or a particular gender. And diamond rings and the fetish items and the rituals of romance are very similar, right? They were all made up. They were made up pretty recently. White wedding dresses. People did not wear white wedding dresses in 1910. Why? Who could afford a dress you could wear on one day? What had to happen is you had to have mass production in factories of an item that a middle-class person could afford to buy and wear once, right? So all these things we think of as, oh, but people have always had diamond rings and white weddings. And of course, it's very recent. It's 100 years old, much of that stuff. And companionate marriage, the idea that a woman might say no, regardless of what her father thinks, that's maybe 150 years old. So that doesn't mean they're not real. That doesn't mean that we don't care deeply about them. It doesn't mean that people don't spend on average $12,000 to $15,000 on their wedding dress, which they often take out debt to do.
Yeah.
But it means that these are socially produced formations that could, in fact, shift if we wanted to shift them. If we wanted to think differently, what else could we spend that $12,000 on? You know, that diamond ring actually doesn't have any value once you walk out of the diamond store. It's not a fungible object. You can't go back and sell it for $4,000 if you paid $4,000. Well, you probably paid $8,000. $4,000 would be cheap, right? So all these things are truly imbued with magic and possibility for us, but because our culture and our society and our history produce them in certain ways.
So I didn't know that they didn't wear white at weddings before, say, 100 to 120 years ago. That's interesting to realize how weddings have changed to the way we know them today. What did they wear back then? What did an old-style wedding look like?
If you look at a wedding from before the 1930s or even the 1940s, you'll see women in their Sunday best, like their absolute best dress. That was often black or dark green. It was somber. It wasn't white. And I believe the first person to wear white at her wedding was Queen Victoria, the Virgin Queen. But who could afford to have a dress that you only wore once? You had to have mass production in factories. So capitalism had to happen in certain ways for that to be possible.
Very interesting. And that's percolated down all the way today and has blown way out of proportion. Okay, so let's talk about dating apps.
Okay.
And I know you mentioned that you have a chapter in your book about this. How do you think that's influenced dating culture today, especially with Gen Z and hookup culture, whether it being on college campuses or even off, even in regular life? How has this become an influencing factor or not with the way things are going now? Because anybody who's in for a long-term relationship and wants to be with one person for a long amount of time is considered to be old school now. The turnaround time on relationships is much faster than one would assume. Dare I say, even the emotions behind it are not 100% there. Gen Z has a much harder time opening up and trusting someone. The definition of a relationship is changing more and more. How would you say that dating apps have influenced this, if at all, or not?
Yeah, no, they've influenced a lot. But even before dating apps existed, millennials invented hookup culture, which is not to say that people didn't have one-night stands before that. They did. In fact, they had more, people of my generation, Gen X, had more one-night stands than college students today.
Oh, okay.
Interestingly.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the same rules of lack of emotional connection around them, and there was no rule that they couldn't lead to a relationship. So millennials really invented hookup culture in this really interesting way, and I would argue that in part it has to do with a different ideology, and that is the ideology of pornography. So millennials were the first generation who easily had access as young people to pornography online, and it created a kind of hookup culture where sex became about the money shot, if you'll excuse my crude language, right? It became about the man's orgasm. And we start to see a big dip in women's orgasms on campus. There's a big differential starting around the year 2000 between women experiencing orgasm and men experiencing orgasm. So what we see is hookup culture on university campuses producing a very male-oriented, orgasm-focused sex culture in which one is not supposed to express emotions. You're not supposed to get the person's number and text them the next day. You're not even really supposed to say hi to them. You're supposed to keep it completely and utterly emotionless. And what a lot of sociologists have found, this isn't my own research, but people like Lisa Wade, who wrote American Hookup, what a lot of sociologists have found is people aren't really happy with this.
Yes.
And actually, weirdly, straight men are the least happy with this situation. So that's kind of interesting, right? That the ideology of pornography, which is that sex should be about the man's orgasm and not in any way about mutual pleasures, and sex shouldn't lead to emotional connection. That ideology has permeated university campuses. And to some extent, dating app culture, depending on the dating app, obviously Grindr and Tinder, that's very much the case. What was interesting in my interviews is as people decide they want to exit from hookup culture and enter romance culture, they often use dating apps in a very strategic way to get to a marriageable person. It was a kind of misuse of dating apps, if you will, where they sort of treated it like a battle, and they were the general, and they were like, okay, the first meetup, it's a coffee, it's 15 minutes. If that goes okay, you can have a walk. If that goes okay, there could be a dinner, right? And so they started to use it as ways of weaning out who was a marriageable subject and who wasn't. And I found that a really interesting use of something that was produced to get us to want more and more and more, right? Dating apps want to keep you on dating apps.
Yeah.
They don't really want you to leave. And so that fantasy they present of endless possibility, and no matter what, there's just always someone else, not just someone else, there's 2,347 someone else's within a 150-mile radius, right? So that idea of endless choice, which is a brilliant capitalist concept, right? Oh, you don't like this toothpaste? Use this toothpaste. You don't like that date? Use this date. More and more and more, you're just going to be happier and happier, even though we know psychologically people aren't happier with endless choice, and there's decision fatigue and all this stuff starts to happen to people. And everyone I interviewed, even the ones who use dating apps just for hookup culture, said that they felt like it was a dating apocalypse. It was absolutely horrifying. And they hated who they became, and they hated everyone else on the apps, right? And they didn't think it was bringing out the best in humanity. But some people use them for romantic ends of finding a marriageable subject and got married from them. So I think because you're in university culture, that's probably not very common. But 10 years from now, you'd be surprised how people in their 30s are using dating apps.
Just that small shift of a couple of years makes all the difference, I think. And even with college students, if they don't use dating apps, even if it's just on campus, there's a higher rate of people being dissatisfied with their relationships. And even in high school, I saw this, and this is all the way back in India, that people tend to go for the more toxic relationships before they actually go for the real ones. It's almost as if, I don't know, there's something attractive about a relationship where you're losing something, and then you realize, oh, that's not good for me at all. I'm going to do a 180 flip and go get into a healthy relationship, and I'm going to get something that's good for me. But the realization time that takes is increasing more and more. Like, people will be in abusive relationships. They will get into toxic relationships where it's draining for both people in it, and then finally have a wake-up call. And I think that's more with my generation. I don't know if that's something that's been there for a while.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to know because I really only know about university culture and afterwards, because in the U.S. you cannot study people under 18 in and around sexuality, or it's very, very difficult, let's say. But I will say we do see a huge amount of dissatisfaction. I mean, there's a book I teach in my class called The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, which is really about how it's not working for heterosexual women. And you could ask any straight woman on campus whether she's happy with hookup culture, and the answer is going to be no, of course I'm not.
Yeah.
But what's hard and what's difficult to understand is we didn't create these scripts. They were already created for us. And so changing them requires communal action. We can't individually change them. As one student said to me, I would be considered insane if I asked a man to care about my pleasure during a hookup.
That itself speaks volumes. So let's segue a little away from here. One of the things that I've been thinking about is how do social narratives of romance specifically affect young people's approaches to relationships? And we're talking about hookup culture and Gen Z. And like, do you really think that believing love conquers all helps individuals sometimes ignore red flags? Like, that's something I've seen even with my friends. There may be some serious, serious issues, but they're blind to it. It's like those rose-tinted glasses that come about, and then when they shatter, they shatter. But do you think it's that idea of love conquers all?
Yeah, I don't think there's as much pressure on university campuses. I do think as you get older, there'll be more and more pressure. But I think there is some belief from romance that your life is better and happier if you have someone with whom you have a romantic relationship, right? You're one, you're boo. And I think it's interesting to think about how romance is an ideology. And what do I mean by that? An ideology hides real conditions behind a smokescreen. In this case, a smokescreen is like fairy dust and magic will happen and so on and so forth. And so the real conditions can be actually a lot of relationships, and particularly within conditions of patriarchy or white supremacy, can be pretty bad. But the ideological claim that love conquers all, love is all you need, that none of those aren't true. Love does not conquer all. Love is not all you need. You need all sorts of things to be happy. But those are ideological smokescreens that hide us from the real conditions of our lives. And perhaps they can give us solace in times of fear and precarity, but they can also lead us down the garden path, as it were.
Okay, and do you think there's so again, in my mind I have the mental background of India, which of course is very different from what it is in the United States, but at least in India what I can comment on is there is an inherent push from a young age to get married. Like we've spoken about this when we were planning out the episode, that not everybody chooses to get married in the US. In fact, it's more on the uprise now that people don't want to get married anymore. In India, it's not an option. It's part of the thing. It's like you go to high school, you finish your degree there, you go to college, you finish college, get out of college, get a job, get married, have kids. It's like a thing. It's like this is benchmarks that need to happen to have a successful life. Now, we know that shift's happening here, but do you think it's somewhat similar still to India in the sense that while yes, there is a shift towards marriage is not something for everyone, but is there still pressure that it's something that you need for a successful life?
I think it depends. So I'm going to talk about politics now, and excuse me, but
okay.
So marriage is not randomly distributed in the United States. People who are married tend to be whiter, wealthier, and more educated. Right now, there is a political administration or regime that is releasing a bunch of pro-natalist policies to try to enforce a particular sort of family formation, heterosexual, mother, father, biological child or children, that's very concerned with producing a certain sort of family and will give certain benefits to those families, right? So we even heard the Department of Transportation say they're only going to give funding to areas with high marriage and birth rates. There's some discussion in the administration of giving government grants to scholars on the basis of whether they're married and have children, so like reserving 40% of them for them. So what we see is a state that's very invested in a certain sort of marriage formation. They don't mean gay, and they don't mean step-parent, and they don't mean polygamy. They mean heterosexual, dyadic, with biological offspring. That probably isn't going to work. The interesting thing about pro-natalist policies is they've been historically very unsuccessful. You see a lot of them going on in Russia right now, Hungary, certainly under Hitler's Nazism and under Mussolini's fascism, there were pro-natalist regimes. That's probably not going to work. How you convince people to get married is Hollywood or Bollywood. How you convince people to get married is rom-coms. How you convince them to get married is get them addicted to reading romance novels, one after the other after the other. 25% of books published in the U.S. are romance novels. So ideology is a much better tool than state policy. And to that extent, I would suggest that a state would have to control culture in order to produce those effects, which is not to say that a state couldn't control culture. States have done that before. But at this point, there would have to be a lot of work done to convince people that they needed to be in heterosexual, dyadic, reproductive relationships, because that doesn't seem to be what people are doing. To be clear, the U.S. has always been invested in those relationships. And for instance, 130 years ago or so, the U.S. military was sent to Utah to stop polygamous marriages. I mean, the U.S. has always, from the 1800s forward, been very invested in a particular sort of sexual citizen, and that citizen is heterosexual, married, and reproductive. But also, to be clear, it's not been super successful. So, which is to say things can shift, right? Things could shift in India, where you have a similar state with a similar investment in a particular kind of national sexual identity, and they could shift in India, they could shift here. There could be a control of culture. There could be coercive policies that force people to get married. I know that China recently instituted some policies about if you're not married, you have to leave your job. So those policies can be instituted, and they could be instituted. But my guess is that humans are perverse in our ability to follow orders, and particularly when it comes to matters of who we love and who we don't love. I mean, look at the persistence of queerness, regardless of laws against it, right?
Yeah.
Well, there are some populations the U.S. wants to control. And, of course, many, many people were sterilized under eugenics programs that went really through the 1970s. And some incarcerated people have been sterilized as well, so often against their will or knowledge. So, yeah, there are some people we don't want to reproduce, but there's a particular sort of family formation that we do want to have kids. And I would assume that's similar in India, right? The good news is most regimes have not been particularly successful at it. So in fascist Italy, they had taxes on bachelors, who I assume were probably gay men, and they just paid the extra taxes. So I think that it's unusual for a state to be able to enforce these things, but they can enforce them at the margins, and people can suffer at the margins, of course. If one thing we know is true, it's that the history of romance and the history of marriage tells us is that things will change. Whatever you think is timeless and has always been that way isn't timeless, and it hasn't always been that way. And what it is 100 years from now will be very, very different than it is now. That I can assure you.
What do you think it means when one says that romance promises us a safe and secure future? Because even though our real future is very precarious right now, whether it's jobs or the climate or politics or whatever it is, when everything starts to feel unstable or upside down, people really, really double down on the idea of the perfect life, the one soulmate, the dream wedding, Instagram-worthy events, and the perfect Instagram wedding. That's the other thing, actually. We didn't speak about the one soulmate. Is that something that's pushed, again, by governments or by various other influencing factors, whether it's industry or Hollywood? Is that an attempt to kind of limit polyamory by having the one soulmate, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I think you couldn't even have an idea of soulmate until that switch in marriage happened where women could say no, right?
Okay.
Until you could have companionate marriage as opposed to your father said you were marrying this person and that's what it was going to be. You couldn't have an idea of a soulmate. But obviously it was produced in Disney. You've seen the Disney classics. There's always that magical moment when the prince and the princess see each other either in the forest or the ballroom, wherever it is. And obviously that's the person they have to marry.
Yeah.
And there's a million Hollywood stories with similar narratives. And romance novels are very interesting. They're shifting a little. There's certainly more various sex in them, and there's certainly more gay and lesbian friendly than they used to be. In fact, one of the biggest romance novels a couple of years ago was a gay romance, read primarily by straight women. It's called Red, White, and Royal Blue, and it's about the Prince of England and the American president's son meeting and falling in love and clearly being destined to be together. So, but the point is that we've been well trained to believe in this, and romance novels are particularly interesting because there are actually rules to romance novels. The Romance Writers of America has a website. You can go on and you can figure out, how do I write a romance novel? And one of the rules is it has to have an emotionally satisfying ending. Okay, emotionally satisfying ending is like that they get together and they live happily ever after. It's not that they go off in their separate directions and they work for environmental justice, right? That's not as emotionally satisfying. What we want is the happily ever after. We need that. We're trained to need that. And so I think we have to think about that as an ideological complex. Disney, Hollywood, romance novels, love songs, and actually Instagram and people's romances as they're curated on Instagram, because nobody ever shows the fight you had over dropping your towel in the middle of the living room floor, right? Nobody ever shows how annoying their partner is, right? You have a curated love story on there, which is one of the reasons social media is so toxic for people's mental health, because everybody's life is perfect. So yeah, I think there's an entire ideological complex that's producing these stories that convince us from a very young age. Think about the first time you saw a Disney film. You were a little kid. And think about the first time you got the idea that you will grow up and get married and then be happy, right? It was when some auntie said to you, oh, when you grow up and find the right woman, you're going to have a great life, right? That's introduced at a very young age. And then in high schools, at least in the U.S., we're trained over and over again to believe that proms are kind of mini weddings, right? And you're trained to have all this romantic affect around the prom,
The dress,
and to
the
spend a lot of
corsage,
money, and the man brings you in a special carriage to the prom, right? Like not a horse-drawn carriage, but a special car that's in a limo or a souped-up Mustang or whatever it is, right? So that it's all this play acting for what you're supposed to get when you're an adult, which is supposed to make you happy and safe and secure, even though it won't, right? I mean, we know from happiness studies that it's about community and social safety nets and all sorts of things, none of which have to do with romance.
Yeah. So on that note, actually, would you say it's time to give up on romance and love, or, well, love with air quotes, or perhaps change our definition of what we expect it to be, like expectations versus reality? What would a healthier, more conscious approach to romance look like?
Yeah, I think it's time for people to start writing other stories. So I want to just talk to all the writers and the musicians. I want to talk to the people who might go work in Hollywood. I think it's time to tell other stories. I don't think it's time to give up on human connection and human support, but I do think it's time to give up on this childish fantasy that's how we get to a happily ever after. And I think we need to expand our definition of love, right? It's not just about the love you have for a partner. It's about the love you have for your community, for your neighborhood, for your extended family, for your family of choice, your friends, right? So I do think it's time to reimagine love as something that might bring us closer to community well-being, less than individual futures.
So not quite yet time to give up on love and romance, just reshape the narrative.
Reshape the narrative so we can imagine our community as a space that will bring us to a better future.
I'm going to leave our audience with something to think about before we move on. Sit back here, pause for a minute, and reflect on values that you really, really value in a relationship versus what society tells you to value. Really sit and think about it, and think about what you value out of your relationships and not what others expect. I think it's something that's needed in today's day and age.
I guess the one thing that we haven't really talked about is how the regulation of romance structures certain hierarchies in our culture.
Okay.
The obvious one is gender hierarchies, right? That seems kind of obvious. I don't really need to explain that to
Yes.
anyone. That would be sociology of the obvious. But I think the other hierarchy that's central to the ideal romance is white supremacy. And elsewhere it might be something else: Hindu supremacy, caste supremacy, male supremacy.
Yeah.
I think all weddings
All
are
weddings,
about
yeah.
the exchange of women, even if we've updated them a bit, right? And also we know that married relationships and partnered relationships produce a huge amount of labor for women in ways that they don't for men, and have huge effects on their careers and their earning potential, et cetera, in all cultures. But certainly in the U.S., the second shift is real. Right. I think it's obvious that romance can be tied up with sexism. But I think it's less obvious that it's tied up with white supremacy. And the reason I say that is because sexual citizenship was always based on who could and couldn't get married. That was often people who were propertied and white. They had to be both those things. Certain groups couldn't get married. Obviously, interracial marriage was illegal until Virginia v. Loving, which is the early 1970s. Same-sex marriage was illegal until 2015. So marriage has always been a way of doling out rights as to who gets to be a full citizen and who doesn't. And in the U.S., that was very much about a formation of whiteness that was propertied, heterosexual, and reproductive. And it continues to be that way in the pronatalist policies of this administration. So I think we should be very skeptical that this is a form of liberation, when in fact the white wedding, the perfect bride, all those things represented a kind of whiteness. So there's somebody who has a book on romance who goes back and looks at all the covers of wedding magazines. And unless it's a particular niche magazine, like aimed at black women, let's say, or gay women, it will have a white, blonde, blue-eyed person on it more than 90% of the time. That is the ideal bride. That's not an accident. And I think that image of the perfect bride has to do with the way in which the state regulated marriage and continues to regulate marriage and continues to regulate benefits. There are 2,000 federal benefits that married people get that unmarried people don't get. It's a huge tax break for people who already have money, right? So to think about the way in which weddings and romance culture are very much situated in a form of white supremacy. And you can see it in Disney films, right? The bad guy is often a little bit darker. Think about Aladdin. Jafar is not only a little bit darker, he's the only one with a clearly Semitic nose, right? Think about The Lion King. Scar is a little bit darker and a lot gayer, right? So the way in which we're constantly taught that love is for everyone and love is all you need, but actually love is highly regulated. Marriage is highly regulated, and it will continue to be so. And I think there are some major fights ahead in terms of the global turn to the right and who will and will not be allowed to get married in the future. So the idea that we're progressing forward and soon marriage will allow polyamorous relationships and gay relationships, and no, it probably won't, and it will probably become more restrictive if fights aren't successful at the moment to humanity for all people who live in a particular country. Maybe people shouldn't get special rights for being married. Maybe you shouldn't get a discount on your car insurance. Maybe you shouldn't get a discount at the food co-op. Maybe married people aren't special. And so that could be something for people to really think about. We just imagine that married people are better and that they deserve these things. And really, it's been a way of distributing resources to people who already have resources. I think things look really grim around the world. I'm somebody who's spent a good portion of my life in Russia and the other portion of my life here in the U.S. And I'm very aware of not just the precarity in the world, but the way in which that precarity is being exploited for certain rights stripping movements, whether it's trans rights or women's rights or gay rights or migrant rights or student rights. And that seems really grim. But my advice is we have to begin to imagine what might come next. I don't think going back to what was before was ever good enough. I don't think settling for fantasies of the perfect wedding was ever what we should have been settling for. And so I think this is really also a moment for us to begin to imagine what the future could look like, how we might not repeat the mistakes of giving rights based on marital status or health insurance on the basis of marital status, how we can imagine an actual happily ever after that includes everyone and brings everyone up to a level of well-being. And that probably involves getting rid of billionaires. And it probably involves stopping our fantasies about wealth accumulation. And it might actually make us happier to do that.
We really appreciated having you here. It was definitely a very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Essig.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you so much for monkeying around with us. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Monkey Mind Lab.